Hi, I'm Neil Van Niekerk. I'm a photographer based in New Jersey. I also do work in New York. One of the areas that I specialize in is time-lapse photography. Now, the beauty about time-lapse photography is that something that takes place over the period of hours, days, weeks, months, even years, you can compress it into a much smaller time frame, much shorter time frame, where the scale of the project or the scale of what's happening is visually a lot more comprehensible. So if something takes place over weeks, you might not really grasp what's happening, or if you show it to a client or to somebody else, they might not quite grasp the enormity of your project. But with time-lapse, you can. Now, time-lapse happens when you take photographs at specific intervals of whatever's happening in front of you, the change. There has to be some kind of a rate of change. And you compress this by creating a video. So video is 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second. But if we slice time up, where we take a photograph every minute or every hour, and we take those little slices at those intervals, and we compile it as 30 frames a second video, suddenly, days, weeks, and months, you can see it in the space of a minute. And really, as I said, it becomes visually a lot more comprehensible. Now, time-lapse photography, well, there's levels and levels to it. But on a basic level, it's not that difficult. But like so many things in photography, it's easy to mess it up. Now with this presentation, I want to show you how you can easily create time-lapse photography, time-lapse videos that look really good. It's not that difficult, so let's hang in there. Now, let's start with the gear. Obviously, you need a camera, you need a lens. I tend to work with more of the wide-angle lenses, wide-angle zooms, because it's landscapes, it's construction, it's city scenery, so it tends to be wider angles. Now I use Nikon D810, 36 megapixels. There's a lot of detail there. It means I can crop in, I can zoom in during the creation of the video. 1080p is around about 2 megapixels. 4K is only around about 6 megapixels. So any camera that you have is probably way more than you really need for time-lapse. So you're in a good position already to create good time-lapse. Now the lenses that I use, I really like the Nikon 14-24, lovely lens, very wide, super sharp towards the edges. I really like it for indoor stuff. But anytime there's construction, whether it's construction dust or sawdust and it's really messy, I'm a little fearful for the front element. And then I tend to use the Nikon 16-35 simply because it takes filters. This way, when I put my camera on a tripod, or I clamp it onto a railing, or clamp it to a suction cup on a window, and there's a lot of dust, I can tape the entire camera and lens into a plastic bag and just leave the front exposed. This way, when I clean the lens afterwards, or clean the filter afterwards, I don't risk scratching the front element of my lens. I can clean it and the camera and the lens is still dust-free. That's my preferred way of working. that's what I use, but let me show you long-term time-lapse setup that I have. And if you look there, you can see the dome. You can see on the left-hand side, you can see the solar panel and the cable that feeds the dome. The camera's in the dome, there's a battery in the dome, there's a controller in the dome. And the solar panel feeds the battery, and you program the timer, the controller, to take a photograph every, let's say, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it might be. Now, because that dome is really small, I use a smaller lens. I use the Nikon 18-35, 3.5 to 4.5 on the camera. It's much more compact than these. So that enables me to put all of this into a dome. Now I use Nikon, but clearly the specific camera doesn't matter. It really is immaterial. We also need neutral density filters. This becomes important. Because you want to slow your shutter speed way down, because you need continuous movement. You need to have that sense of continuous movement. You don't want abrupt, choppy movements. So you want to slow your shutter speed down usually. And if you're shooting in broad daylight, Sunny 16 rule is f11, 60th of a second. That's too fast. That shutter speed is too fast. You'll get really jittery movement. You want to slow it down. And for that, I have a whole range of filters, 3-stop neutral density, 6-stop neutral density. I have 10-stop neutral density filters. And with that, you can bring your shutter speed way down. So neutral density filters, you will find if you work outdoors, is definitely a must. Now, next up on our list, tripods. Now, you need something sturdy. Now, I have small, lightweight tripods. I sometimes use them indoors. But the moment that you work outdoors, or if you put your tripod down on a carpet, you're going to need something chunky. You're going to need something really solid. For that, I use a big fat Manfrotto. It is carbon fiber, but it is pretty solid. And if you put this thing down, it tends to stay. This is what you need, a solid tripod. Can't really go without that. Camera, lens, tripod, and neutral density filters. Starts with a camera on a gimbal and then switches over to the final time-lapse video. Here I use 3 cameras, one clamped to the door frame, the other 2 cameras clamped to the windows with suction cups. Because I couldn't view the back of the camera, I had to use an external monitor to get my composition exact. Now, next thing on our list is an intervalometer. Now, most cameras these days have a built-in intervalometer. The intervalometer will allow you to take photographs for an hour, 30 seconds apart, or for a day and 5 minutes apart, whatever your interval is, and for however long you take it, but your intervalometer will control that. Now, I tend to use external intervalometers, and there's a specific reason for it. Let me just grab one here. I use an external intervalometer. The main reason is if I do construction, I do a construction time-lapse, I will mount the camera up on a bracket somewhere, it'll work, and I will feed it off AC power because the batteries in the camera won't last more than a few hours, and I might be shooting for the entire day or several days. So I'll be running my camera off an AC adapter. I think every camera that's out in the market has one of these. Plug it into power and you juice your camera off AC mains, and that will have you independent of your camera's battery. So back to the intervalometer. Here's the problem is you're feeding your camera off AC mains if you do indoor time-lapse over a day or several days. And the construction crew, when they leave at night, might switch the power off. Your camera dies. So if you've programmed your camera's intervalometer, you're out of luck, because when your camera wakes up again the next morning, it's forgotten. It doesn't remember where it is. Now, if you program your intervalometer, this thing will tick over, let's say, every minute. Every minute it'll take a shot. So at the end of the workday, they switch the power off, camera dies. The intervalometer keeps ticking over, doesn't know that nothing's happening, but it doesn't matter. Next morning, 6 o'clock, the crew arrives, they switch the power on, your camera wakes up, intervalometer keeps ticking, and your time-lapse resumes. So I would suggest, depending on the kind of work you do or the kind of time-lapse project you have, an external intervalometer is a good idea. So that is the basic time-lapse gear. Now we get to the advanced time-lapse gear. That includes motion control. We have dollies and we get rotational devices. If you look at the photograph here, you'll see the dolly. It's about 6 foot long, 2 tripods to keep it rock solid. And in this case, there's a controller and a stepper motor. And the stepper motor will, in conjunction with the controller, move, stop, move, stop, move, stop. And your camera will fire and you will get photographs for the entire period as the camera moves up that dolly. And you get the sense of movement. The camera will sweep up or sweep into something, depending on how you program it. It looks amazing, looks really cinematic, fantastic. Then we also get the rotational dollies. Now, rotational dolly, obviously you'll program it to sweep left to right or right to left. City scene, maybe you'll sweep across the city scene as daylight goes into nighttime. By the way, nighttime into day, daytime into night is called the holy grail of time-lapse photography. It's probably the most difficult part of photography or time-lapse photography, is to get that smooth gradient as your exposure changes and your white balance changes. There's a bit of magic to it, which we control with software. One of the other items we have that's part of the advanced time-lapse gear is exposure control. And this is a hardware or software option to get the holy grail. Now the one that I use is shown in this photograph here. It's the Timelapse Plus View. It controls your shutter speed and your ISO as the exposure ramps from daylight into night or nighttime into day. And it gives you exposures that is more easily controlled again with software afterwards to really smooth it out and give you that perfect gradient. So a bit of specialized gear. It's not essential to start time-lapse photography. It is something you'll probably progress towards when you get really hooked onto this thing. Next, we're going to look at our basic time-lapse workflow. First step is we need good composition. We need an interesting scene. It's the basis of photography. It has to captivate your viewer. It has to be something that's interesting to your viewer. So you have to anticipate also how the scene will change. So if there's something moving in the scene, you'll have to make sure that it stays within the intended frame. So you have to think about the scene that you want to capture, the change in the scenery that you want to capture. So again, you can't escape it. Composition, an essential element of photography. It's at the heart of what we do. That's your first step, is figure out the composition. Now we get to a bit of math. Hang in there. I know some of you might be scared. This stuff is really easy. So we're looking at the program interval. It affects the speed and the flow of action. And we also have to consider how long will the sequence be. In other words, do you want 30 seconds of video or a minute of video or 2 minutes of video? Now, you need to, with your time-lapse video, keep people's attention. So it has to be interesting for a certain time. YouTube metrics show that after a minute, people click away. So I would say that you ideally aim for a minute, maybe a minute and a half. I would say 2 minutes max for a time-lapse video, probably shorter. Now, if you're going to compile several clips, I would say 10-second clips, not really much longer, and you can compile this into a 30-second or a 60-second video. Anyway, you have to decide how long will the sequence be. This will determine the clip length and the number of photographs you're going to need, the number of shots you're going to need. And then also important is the duration of the event being photographed. If somebody is creating something or building something, how long will it take? 3 hours, 6 hours? If there's construction, how long will it take? You will have to get those details out, because this will affect how many photographs you take to get to the video. No two scenes are alike, and these are some of the common interval durations to give you a head start. So for 1 second, moving traffic, fast moving clouds. 1 to 3 seconds, sunsets, sunrises, slow moving clouds, crowds of people. And then 15 to 30 seconds, longer intervals, moving shadows. So if you have the shadows moving across the side of a building, that sweep, 1 second interval is going to be too short. You need something longer. 15 to 30 seconds sounds about good. So you'll gradually get that sweep of the shadow across the building, which looks good. And then the sun across the sky. And if you're photographing plants growing, a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes. And then construction projects could be anywhere from 5 minutes or longer, your interval at which your camera will take a photograph. So those are some of your common interval durations to give you a good idea of where you're headed with this. Selecting a time-lapse interval. Now this is where it gets, not really tricky. This stuff is easy. Hang in there. So the interval is the amount of time between shots. So it depends on how long the scene in front of you is going to take to unfold. The sunset or something being built or whatever it might be. That interval is the amount of time between the shots. So something takes place over a 3-hour period. We got to slice it up and take photographs at certain intervals. Now, our video frame rate is 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. If you're shooting for PAL, a European client, would be 25 frames a second. So let's say 30 frames a second. You might be creating a video that you'll post on YouTube. So that's 30 photographs a second that will create your video. So if something takes place over 3 hours, you have to chop that up into 30 frames a second. How many seconds do you need? And you figure it out. And that's how many photographs it'll take. So that math is coming up now. So with that one number, the interval, you control two things. How fast the time-lapse change appears to take place. And this is an important aspect of time-lapse photography. It can't be dull. Something has to happen. We're photographing the rate of change. And that's all important. It's the rate of change. Something is changing in our scene. And then also important, how smooth that action appears on the screen. Again, we don't want choppy video. We want smooth video. You have to have that continual sense of movement. Next up, the length of your video. If you're photographing a continuous scene, as I said, aim for a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes. If you're photographing snippets, sequences that you want to splice together, I would say aim for 10 to 12 seconds. Now, 10 seconds are good, but you need a lead in and lead out time. So I would say 12 seconds, that's what you're going to aim for. Now you have to decide on your frame rate. This is how fast your video will play back. As I said, 24 frames a second, 25 frames a second for Europe, 30 frames a second. Now, a lot of your videographers will insist that 24 frames a second will give you a more cinematic movement. That might be for video. With time-lapse, I don't think it's that crucial a factor. I go for 30 frames a second. Now, your frame rate affects all your calculations. However, you only set it when you create your video in the end. So it might affect your initial calculations, how long your intervals are and how many photographs you take. But your final decision is when you create the video in Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere or whatever software you use to compile your frames into video. That's at the point that you decide 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. So we're not fixed yet at the point where we're taking the video. Now we have to calculate how many shots. So let's work with a scenario where we have fast-moving clouds. We want a 10-second clip. remember, with 2 seconds buffer for fade in and fade out. So that makes it 12 seconds. So this is just for the scenario, 12 seconds at, let's say, a frame rate of 30 frames a second. How many photos are we going to take? 12 seconds, 30 frames a second, 12 times 30, that's it. 360 photographs. That's how many photographs you're going to take to give you a 30 frames per second video for 12 seconds. Simple math. Just 12 times 30, it gives you 360 photographs. So your interval, now we have to figure out your interval and your shooting time. Now we have to decide on our interval. For fast-moving clouds, let's say 2 seconds is a good choice. Now we have to calculate our shooting time. If we are going to take 360 photographs at 2 seconds apart, how long is it going to take us? 360 times 2, 720 seconds. In other words, 12 minutes. We're going to be shooting for 12 minutes a photograph every 2 seconds to give us a 12-minute video clip. These numbers all interconnect, it's all interlocked. If it sounds confusing and complicated, you get apps for your phone that'll help you with the calculation, but really it's a very simple math. Next, we're going to consider our camera settings, our exposure settings and how we can minimize flicker and how we create motion blur by a choice of our shutter speed using neutral density filters. So looking at this diagram, the interval is the time between each photograph that elapses. So if the interval is 10 seconds, we take a photograph every 10 seconds. We're not going to expose for 10 seconds because your camera has to take another shot. It has to write that frame into your memory card. So if your interval is 10 seconds, you'll have to expose only for a part of that interval. So for 10 seconds, you could expose for a very short period, and then your movement's going to be very jittery, very staccato. If you expose for longer, it's going to be much smoother, but now we risk, if it's too long, we risk the camera not having time to write that photograph from the buffer onto the card. So a good balance here is where our shutter speed is half our interval. So we're going to bring our shutter speed down until it's approximately half the length of our interval. Maybe a bit longer for a bit more smoothness. But definitely we don't want too short, we don't want too long. Let's look at this video clip. The first half of this clip was shot with a 30-second shutter speed at 45-second interval. So with the clouds moving, the cloud's over there, and then 45 seconds later it's over there, and then 45 seconds later it's over there. So when you compile the video, the clouds move rapidly. It really moves fast, as you can see here. You can see that it's crazily rushed, the movement of the clouds. The second half of that clip is 4-second shutter speed with a 5-second interval, and the tempo is immediately much more pleasing to the eye. So that was an example where the interval was just too long and not appropriate for the scene. So we really have to consider an appropriate interval that depicts the movement, the change in the scene at a visually interesting and a visually appealing way. Okay, let's look at the next video. This is a time-lapse clip of the naked cowboy in Times Square. The interval was 3 seconds. In the first sequence, my shutter speed was a 60th. And for the second part, I brought my shutter speed down to half a second. So it's a 60th of a second to half a second. You don't really need the individual images to be sharp. Remember, this is video, not specifically still images. So with video, you need that sense of movement. And if you take an individual video frame very often and there's movement, it's not necessarily sharp. You have that sense of movement. That's important. We don't want that abrupt changes. It just looks jarring. So we want a smooth movement. I think you'll agree the half-second shutter speed worked better here, but you have to balance the need for fluid motion versus losing all the detail in your subject. Here we're going to look at our time-lapse exposure settings. We can shoot in manual exposure mode in your camera. That is when the lighting is very consistent. If the lighting changes, day to night, night to day, most likely aperture priority. You need proper exposure. We're going to shoot in manual exposure mode in your camera if the lighting doesn't change. If there is change in lighting, aperture priority is the mode you want. Now your exposure might vary a little bit because it's an automated exposure mode. It's not fixed, but to get a smooth gradient in our exposure, we're going to use software, and we're going to use a program called LR Timelapse. This is essential to time-lapse photography. If you get serious about time-lapse photography at all, this is where you're headed. I would say pretty much every time-lapse photographer uses that program. The guy who created it is a bit of a genius. You have to have the software. So if you shoot in manual exposure mode, obviously you're going to juggle your ISO, your aperture, shutter speed for correct exposure, while still considering your interval. You have to create some motion blur. Remember, slower shutter speed, use neutral density filters to bring your shutter speed down. Watch your exposure length. It cannot be longer than your interval. The choice of interval is what everything in time-lapse photography revolves around. It'll determine how smooth your video is. It'll determine how long your video is. It will determine how the scene in front of you is displayed. So your choice of interval is important. And according to our choice of interval, we'll choose our shutter speed, we'll choose our aperture, we'll choose everything else around that. We have to shoot in RAW to control our white balance and exposure and contrast and all kinds of other settings. You might be tempted to shoot in JPEG, but there are definite limitations with JPEG. The main one for me is 8-bit staircasing. You get that JPEG artifacting. So if you photograph a flat color like blue skies with clouds moving, that blue sky will start shimmering. There's a weird block pattern that starts moving around in the sky. It doesn't look good. The antidote to that is to work in a 14-bit environment with the RAW files. And you work with a 14-bit or a 16-bit TIFF file, and you export that as a video. And in that way, you avoid the jaggies, the weird JPEG staircasing effect. So definitely I would recommend shooting in RAW from the start. So other settings in a camera that's important, manual focus. You do not want to use autofocus. If that camera starts hunting, it might not trip the shutter, or alternately, if it grabs different points in the scene, there's that focus breathing. It just looks horrid. You have to absolutely nail your focus and manual focus. Now, I use a piece of gaffer tape to tape my focusing ring down. So if my camera's my tripod or on a clamp somewhere, I will autofocus in my scene. I will lock the focus, I'll take a test shot, I'll make sure that my focusing is correct, and then with a piece of tape, I will tape that focusing ring down. So this way I can't accidentally knock the focusing ring. It's just part of my workflow. Tape that focusing ring down, absolutely shoot in manual focus. Don't forget that. The other important part is stabilization, your vibration reduction, that needs to be off. You need to not have your camera and your lens change anything from shot to shot. It has to be rock solid. And that means your sensor has to be fixed. You don't need vibration reduction. You can be shooting on a tripod anyway. So vibration reduction off and manual focus, remember that. So another thing is make sure your batteries are full. Batteries are fully charged. Make sure your memory cards are empty. Make sure you have enough space for all the photographs you're going to take on your memory cards. I tend to shoot RAW plus RAW, as in backup. But if it's a longer project where I need the capacity, I will shoot RAW plus RAW as an overflow to double the capacity of my camera. But it's always good to be a little paranoid about data loss. But sometimes you just have to risk RAW plus RAW and shoot in overflow mode. But in most cases with projects like that, I'll be using multiple cameras. So if a camera fails or a memory card fails, I have the other cameras to back me up with a different angle of the same scene. A little bit more about the camera settings itself. Obviously, everyone uses different cameras, so it's going to vary depending on what you use. I want to show you what I set on the Nikon D810 that I use to give an idea of the thought process that goes into it. Now, if you use a DSLR, it's very important that you close the eyepiece, because especially when you use neutral density filters, light travels in through the viewfinder, bounces around the inside of the camera and leaves all kinds of streaks and weird artifacts. And also it inflates your exposure reading. So definitely if you use a DSLR with long exposures, especially if you use neutral density filters, IP is closed. Now with this camera I've set the function button in the front. If I hit it, my menu pops up. And my menu in this case is configured specifically for use with time-lapse photography. At the top, I have battery info. This is always useful to know immediately. And then time zone and date. Now I use 5 different Nikon D810s for my time-lapses. 5 cameras that are exactly the same so that it is easier for my workflow to incorporate all the photographs from the different cameras. If you start mixing between different cameras, you're creating yourself a headache if you use multiple cameras for time-lapse. So I will set the time zone and date very precisely to the second for each of the cameras so that I can time my footage. Interval timer shooting, this is when I use the built-in intervalometer to shoot time-lapse. If I'm out on location, I'll do that. On location where I don't attend the camera and it's running off AC power, I'll definitely run off an external intervalometer. Secondary card slot function. I can choose between overflow or backup. Now I do shoot RAW, so normally I would, with any event, I'd be shooting backup, so I shoot RAW plus RAW to the 2 cards. But often I need the expanded capacity, then I'll go to overflow. Next up, ISO sensitivity. This is also important. I set a base setting of 100 ISO, however, I keep my auto ISO on, so that as it gets darker, my camera can bump up the ISO. I have a maximum of 1600, that's what I feel comfortable with the Nikon D810, that I can handle the noise. And then my slowest shutter speed that I will accept is 2 seconds. I might change it to 1 second, or faster depending on the situation, but 2 seconds is good. You do want that continuity, that persistence of vision as the images flow into each other, so a slower shutter speed works well. Next up, image area. Now the Nikon D810 that I use has 36 megapixels. That's a huge amount of information. So I might crop into the image by going to a 1.2 crop or a 1.5 crop. The 1.2 crop gives me around about a 24 megapixel image. RAW files are smaller and faster to process, and it takes up less space on the disk. So with an ultra wide angle zoom, I might zoom as wide as I can, but then crop to 1.2 if I don't think I'm going to need that extreme amount of information. Then also the virtual horizon, very important for me to level my camera so that I don't have to do it in post-production. And that about covers the basic settings on my cameras. As I said, I do use identical cameras between all my time lapses so that it makes for a much faster workflow. Another consideration is minimizing flicker. Now, flicker we can get rid of with software. And again, LR Timelapse is the piece of software that I would highly recommend. But there are other software options available to minimize flicker. Now, where flicker arises is we think in terms, as photographers, we think of f11 as being f11. You take a photograph of a landscape or a portrait and use f8 or f11 or whatever your choice of aperture is. You think that is exact, but the real world encroaches a little bit on us. f11 might not always be f11. So with open aperture metering, your camera will open up to the widest aperture so you can view the scene, and then the moment you trip the shutter, it stops down to taking aperture. So your camera wide open, takes the shot, opens up again, closes, opens up, closes again. It might not close down to exactly f11, might be a tiny bit more, tiny bit less. So if you photograph portraits in the studio or outside, or you're photographing a landscape, you will never notice that f11 is not quite exactly the same. But the moment you string 900 images together, that tiny variation in the aperture, not closing down quite to f11 or closing a little bit more or being on top of 11, that slight variation will appear as flicker. It's horrendous to see. Now there's hardware options around that. I know that a lot of time-lapse photographers shoot with Canon cameras and they use old manual focus Nikon lenses. And this way the aperture control is decoupled from the camera. Every time you take the shot, the aperture doesn't close down and opens up again. So you'll open up the aperture ring, focus, get all your settings, and then close down to your taking aperture. And then hundreds or thousands of images will be at exactly the same aperture, it doesn't vary. So that's one option of controlling flicker, is manual option, mechanical option, where the camera doesn't control the lens aperture. The lens aperture stays absolutely fixed. But in the end, we will correct flicker with software. So the next step, the final step, is test and organize. You're going to spend hours photographing a scene. You don't want to mess it up with one little thing that you didn't set correctly. So just be very systematic, go through all your settings again and again, and just make sure everything is absolutely in lockstep and ready, and then you do the sequence. So test, organize, make sure it works. Now that you've shot all the images for your time-lapse video, you need to compile them into the actual video. For this, there are several programs you can use. Adobe Premiere's one, Final Cut Pro's one, that's what I use. There are several others. So you're going to generate probably JPEGs out of your raw files after you've processed them, and you're going to bring them into Final Cut Pro or Premiere, and you're going to generate the video from that. But you're going to need to process your images a little bit. And I think inevitably you're going to be wanting to use LR time-lapse. I've got a screen capture here to show you what it looks like. It analyzes all your images and it starts ramping your exposure and your white balance to give you a very smooth gradient from start to end. This next screen, you can see the list of images there. You will create keyframes and various keyframes. Let's say again 900 images. Start and end will be two keyframes, and in between you'll select a few places where I need to fix the exposure this way or the white balance this way, and those are your reference points. And LR Timelapse will create that gradient in between and adjust your files for you to give you a very smooth final video. And the program analyzes it and adjusts your files for you. You might have to do it a few times because it runs iteratively. It doesn't really need much hands-on from you aside from adjusting your keyframes and finally looking if the output looks good. And from this, then you would bring it into Lightroom. I still use Bridge, and you would generate your JPEGs, and that's what you would pull into Final Cut Pro or Premiere and then generate your video. For output on YouTube or similar, or for social media, 1080p is good. Some clients might expect 4K. This is the kind of thing that you would set in your post-production, in your program that generates the videos for you. And then finally, I would like to show you some of my time lapses and what went on behind the scenes, the logistics, the equipment that I used and how I set it up and what was involved in creating the time lapses for my clients. On my website, I try and push the idea that I'm a problem solver, that no matter what they throw at me, I will figure out a way to do it, and usually I can. Each project requires perhaps a slightly different approach, and I would like to show you some of that. This time-lapse video shows a wedding venue being prepared. For this video, I used 4 different cameras. The main camera was mounted way up high, running off AC power, and that gave me a baseline video to add the other segments to. Then I had 3 other cameras on tripods that I moved around the set as they built it out, giving a very dynamic video. Another wedding reception site being built out, this time on the front lawn of the bride's father's house. I used one camera. For the first 10 days, the camera was mounted in this waterproof dome overlooking the tent, and then when the tent was built, I moved it inside and clamped it to a high beam. Outdoors, the camera was running off a battery and a solar panel. Indoors, it was running off AC power and an external intervalometer. Now quickly back to me using the 36 megapixel Nikon D810. One advantage of using so many pixels is it gives me a lot of real estate to work with. Now if you look at the scene in New York, because I'm shooting with a 16mm to 35mm lens at the widest end, if I point my camera slightly upwards, all the buildings start to lean in. It doesn't look good. So I correct my perspective in post-production and apply this correction to all my images before I export it. Now in pulling the perspective upright, or your vertical's vertical, you start losing a bit of real estate. The 36 megapixels become about, let's say, 24 megapixels. Still plenty for you to punch in and zoom in post. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Hopefully it was of interest and maybe inspired you to create time-lapse videos. As I said in the beginning, it's not that difficult. You just have to be very consistent, very particular. It's not that difficult, but it is easy to mess it up. Just be very specific about what you do. So thank you for hanging in there. Again, I hope there's something that you picked up from this that's of use to you. And I'd love to hear your questions. Thank you.